A woman whose ex-husband was jailed for attacking her told Susanna and me that here in Britain, the government's early prison release scheme is taking away victims' control, which they have fought so hard to regain.
And taking away healing. It comes as more than 1,000 more inmates set to be freed today to clear overcrowded prisons across England and Wales. Here's what Elizabeth Hudson told us earlier.
If you've been in an abusive relationship, you've walked on eggshells, you've changed your behaviour, you've felt controlled, and then you have this period of peace, this period of freedom where you can walk around and you're not looking over your shoulder, and that's incredibly precious, incredibly precious. But you know it's over, you know there's a time frame on that, but for them to just reduce that ridiculously is so unbelievably cruel, actually.
Well, the Secretary for Justice, Shabana Mahmood, joins us live from Westminster now. Good morning.
Good morning.
So those in prison for domestic abuse aren't eligible for early release under this scheme. So here's what Elizabeth, who you just saw there, and frankly we, and I would say probably all of our viewers, cannot comprehend. Her ex-husband held a knife to her throat in the kitchen of their home. He's subject to a restraining order and possibly an exclusion order when he does get out, possibly by Christmas. How can that possibly not be seen as a classic case of domestic abuse?
Well, look, I think, of course, it is a case of domestic abuse. The way that the emergency releases work is in order to make the change in a legal way, you have to target the offences and not the offenders directly. And there isn't an offence of domestic abuse specifically. The offences that are most closely connected to domestic abuse cases, such as stalking, coercive control, non-fatal strangulation, all of those are excluded from the emergency release measures, but it won't cover all of those other offences that take place in a domestic abuse setting, but are offences of assault or others. So, look, I do hear this this case very strongly. I've been engaging with people who advocate for victims groups and victims directly. I do understand the point that is being made. What I would say is these changes were forced upon us as a result of the prison system being on the point of collapse.
Yes, so hang on.
When I walked into the Justice Department on the 5th of July, we were on the brink of disaster in our prisons, and I had to...
Can we stick to this case before we broaden out the discussion, OK? What you've just said, basically, is shorthand for he's getting out on a technicality. He is clearly a domestic abuser. That woman is not far short of being terrified. She doesn't seem to count at all in the government's calculations. Yes, of course, you've got a problem with overcrowded prisons. Yes, of course, that's not your fault. You've only just come into power. But you are releasing a man who is a classic domestic abuser on a technicality.
Well, look, we have sought to exclude all of those offences that are most closely connected to domestic abuse. It's not a technicality; it's a point of law. Unfortunately, it's a point of law. It's a point of law that requires us to target offence types and not offender types. I had to pull these levers in an emergency manner as soon as I took office because we were on the brink of an absolute disaster in our prison estate. We were down in August. By the bank holiday in August, we were down to fewer than 100 places left across the whole of our prison estate. But I just want to give some of the context.
Specific, just for now. I promise you we'll come on to the broader.
We will come on to the
broader issues in a moment. But you really must allow us to address this issue on behalf of our guests earlier, rather than broadening it out. Now, you talk about it being a matter of law. Well, then, to quote Dickens, the law's an ass, isn't it?
Well, look, I think the context here is important. The reason why I'm giving that context is we would have failed all victims in this country and, in fact, the whole of the country if we had allowed a situation where we completely ran out of prison places. We were on that brink of that disaster when I took office in July, and I had to act immediately. I've sought to pull all of the available levers at my disposal in the safest way possible and to try and clamp down on, emergency releases happening in a way that doesn't allow victims the chance to get ready and to be prepared. That's why I pulled the lever so early on taking office and didn't wait weeks or months trying to weigh it all up, because I wanted to give the probation service the time to prepare and make sure that we didn't run out of prison places in the meantime. We have tried in every way to make sure that victims who are part of the victim notification scheme are notified in the usual way. But these are emergency measures because we were about to run out of prison places,
yes,
and we've got to avoid that at all costs.
Look, you can't talk your way out of the clock on this interview. You have to let us in to ask the odd question now and again. And you've repeated yourself 3 times now about the crisis that you face in the prisons, and that's not under dispute. As Justice Minister, as a woman, you cannot be comfortable with this man being released early. You can't be.
Look, I'm not happy that we've had to pull a lever that has meant the emergency release of some offenders. Those emergency releases are taking place so that offenders are out a few weeks or months earlier than they otherwise would have been. In many of these cases that have been discussed in the media, the releases are taking place around 2 to 3 months earlier than they would have under the previous system. And I know that whilst that might sound like a small amount of time, for victims, that's actually a really big deal, exactly as you've been hearing on your programme this morning. That's why I've sought to pull these levers in a way that has given the probation service the time to prepare.
Okay. Just to interrupt,
victims to be notified as well.
As Richard says, you know, it's really important we don't repeat information here that you've already said. People understand the context. The point is that the government said it was going to exclude domestic abusers from early release. Clearly, you are not excluding domestic abusers from early release.
Forgive me, but as I have said before, and I do have to repeat the point, we've excluded offences. The way that you make this change in the law is by excluding offence types rather than a class of offender, which is how we normally talk about domestic abusers. There isn't a specific offence of domestic abuse. That's why I sought to exclude from this scheme those offences that are most closely connected to domestic abuse settings.
You can't
but
say
of course
that
there
you're
are still
going
others.
Yeah. You can't say that you're excluding domestic abusers from this scheme. You're basically acknowledging this morning that those criminals responsible of intimidating, assaulting, attacking their domestic victims, their partners, their ex-partners, they're not excluded from early release.
Well, I've always said, and I've always been accurate on the law here, which is that we have sought to exclude those offences that are most closely connected to domestic abuse settings. That includes non-fatal strangulation, for example, which we know is an offence that often happens in a domestic abuse setting, but it doesn't cover every type. It doesn't cover every... It doesn't cover every single type of offence. All serious violence that attracts a sentence of over 4 years is excluded. All sexual offences are also excluded. Those sentencing decisions that you're just referring to there are a matter for the independent judiciary, who have to make a decision based on the facts of the case in front of them. But not every case would be excluded.
Obviously, and in this case, it's not. It feels like a total failure for Elizabeth Hudson. She sent you an email, she says, a week ago. She hasn't had a response. Let's just have a listen to what she said.
I wrote a letter and I've received no response, not even a holding response.
What did you say?
I outlined the whole details of the case, the fact that in his second attack to his partner, it was non-fatal suffocation and non-fatal strangulation, which are offences that they've listed as being excluded.
As domestic abuse.
Yeah. And for whatever reason, that hasn't been flagged. I've CC'd in people like Jess Phillips, Yvette Cooper, Lord Timpson. Nobody has responded.
She doesn't count at all, does she? She just doesn't count. She doesn't matter, does she?
No, of course she does, and I'm very sorry. I'm not aware of her email. I will track that down when I get back to the department later this morning, and I'll ensure that she receives a response. The other offences, by the way, that she refers to there, and I'm obviously just hearing that for the first time, but they would be excluded under this scheme. Let me look into the exact details of that case, and I'll be happy to engage with her.
So, at face value, then, just listening to that brief excerpt, you think that maybe this is a screw-up?
No,
that this guy shouldn't be released?
Look, I can't make decisions based on cases that are just being presented to me that I'm listening in on. However, because she's referred there to charges of non-fatal strangulation, there might not yet be a conviction. I would need to look at what's going on in that case, which I'd be happy to look at her email and respond to her.
She says that you shouldn't let anybody out whose offences have resulted in a restraining order to protect the victim. They should be excluded from early release. That sounds eminently sensible.
Breaches of restraining orders are excluded from early release.
No, she didn't say breach of a restraining order. She says you shouldn't let anybody out whose offences resulted in a restraining order. So if they are under a restraining order, they shouldn't be eligible for early release.
They are excluded. They are already excluded. As I say, I'll look at the exact details of the case that she raises, but those offences are excluded.
Our understanding is that, as you say, if they're in breach of a restraining order, then we're in a different league. But simply because they have a restraining order, which this man has, that doesn't mean that they're excluded from the early release system. I'm not sure if you quite understand your own rules.
No, with respect, I think that there is a misunderstanding of how the law works here. Restraining order offences are excluded from this scheme. Of course, you have to breach that.
Then why is he being released as soon as Christmas?
Let me have a look at the details of that specific case. I'm not going to be able to litigate all of the different elements of that case, which I'm hearing about for the first time on your programme this morning. What I would say is we have sought to exclude from this scheme all of those offences that are most closely connected to domestic abuse settings, but that doesn't, and we've always acknowledged, that doesn't cover everything that we would, in the ordinary run of things, consider to be domestic abuse related cases. That is because, as a matter of law, we have to attack sentence types and exclude sentence types, not types of offenders. So I know that is difficult. It was a difficult choice to make. We had to act quickly because of the emergency situation we inherited.
Can I just establish something, because I think people will be confused. This man has been given 2 indefinite restraining orders. Are you saying on this programme he should not therefore be eligible for early release,
well, look,
and yet she has received a letter saying he is?
Look, I'm going to have to look at the full details of that case, OK? So I don't think it's appropriate for me as a Lord Chancellor to litigate on your programme without knowing the full facts of your case. The principal position is there are exclusions to this scheme. Those exclusions are working. All offences relating to sexual offences, serious violence, they are already excluded. If there are concerns that an exclusion hasn't worked the way it should, I'd be happy for people to raise that with me, but the exclusions are in place.
In that
well,
case,
look, I have said already, I will look at that case specifically and look at the details of that case. Then, I don't think I can usefully say more without the full details of that in front of me.
In that case, then, can I suggest that you look at all the other cases where men with restraining orders are about to be released? Because I cannot believe that this is a singular case. So it's great that you're going to look at Elizabeth's case, but can you broaden that and see if she's not alone in being a victim of what is clearly domestic violence, who was about to see the perpetrator released early and wrongly? Minister, thank you very much indeed for your time this morning.
I don't know if it's wrongly. I'm happy to look at it. The exclusions are working as they should. I will make sure that they have worked as they should in this case.
Well, I'm sorry, but if a man who holds a knife to his wife's throat in the kitchen of their family home hasn't committed an act of domestic abuse, then I'm a turkey. Thank you very much for joining us.